Okay, so have you ever felt that deep, almost ancient knot of dread? When something truly huge, uncontrollable just slams into your life.
Oh, yeah.
We're
Absolutely.
talking about those moments when the natural order feels totally upended. Maybe the sky goes dark, an unexpected eclipse, or a massive storm hits your town without the usual warning.
Or some global crisis unfolds that just, it defies any easy explanation.
Exactly. And in those moments, our brains, they're wired for survival, right? For
Mhm.
meaning. They often default to the oldest questions like, who did
What
this?
angered the gods?
Who do we blame? It's this really visceral gut reaction almost etched into us.
Primal.
Now, in our modern society, we pride ourselves on having, sophisticated explanations for things, don't we?
We certainly tried to, yeah. Policy, politics, data.
Right. We lean on detailed policy analyses,
Yeah.
complex political theories, tons of data science. We genuinely think we've moved way beyond those, well, primitive superstitions.
Yeah.
Blaming gods for bad harvests.
Sure. That sounds like ancient history.
But here's the really interesting, maybe even unsettling question that our source material digs into today. What if that eclipse fear, that raw animal dread that needs a single cause for chaos, what if it's actually still alive and kicking, just, repackaged, projected onto new figures?
That's the core of it, yeah.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is pretty straightforward. We take source material articles, research, our own notes, and we really try to pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the surprising facts, the compelling insights.
Basically giving you a shortcut to being well-informed.
Exactly. With maybe a bit of humor, hopefully an engaging chat. So today, we're diving deep into how these ancient patterns of blame, of belief, they seem to show up in really modern ways, specifically around a very prominent figure in recent American politics. We're going to unpack this really thought-provoking idea from one source about how a Trump-shaped hole has emerged, but not like in people's hearts necessarily, but really powerfully in their heads.
In their thinking.
And just to be super clear up front, this isn't about taking sides. It's not about endorsing any political view or even debating policy. Our goal here is just to neutrally understand this powerful, almost primal dynamic that the source material describes and what it might tell us about how we all perceive and react to this complex world.
And what's really fascinating, and the source really hammers this point home, is that this isn't just some, casual metaphor or clever phrase.
Right.
The material suggests it's a pretty deep-seated psychological thing, maybe even sociological. It's like, despite all our modern advances, our PhDs, our belief in rational thought, certain basic human fears, basic needs, they're still there. These ancient anxieties, the source argues, they subtly, almost invisibly, influence how we see things, how we react to chaos, to stuff we can't control.
Okay.
So the core argument we're exploring is how one person, or maybe more like the idea of that person, the projection,
The projection.
yeah, can become this sort of magnet for collective anxiety,
Right.
for blame, a focal point for everything we struggle to understand or control. It's about the human mind needing a story, needing a narrative, even if that story means putting a single face on the storm.
Okay, let's unpack that, this idea of ancient fears. The source really digs into how, historically, plague hits a village or a drought wipes out the harvest, people immediately looked for a who.
Right. Not a what or how, necessarily.
Exactly, a specific entity, a person, a god, someone to blame for the suffering. It just sounds so primitive to us now, doesn't it?
It really does. Like something out of history book about, pre-scientific times, or some old myth, totally removed from our data-driven world.
Yeah.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, the source argues really strongly that this isn't just a historical footnote, a relic. It's just that modern Americans, even with all our reliance on rational explanations, policy analysis, political theory, science,
All that stuff.
deep down, we still harbor this eclipse fear. That raw, gut-level dread that just demands a face, a single mouth that whispered the curse,
Wow. Okay.
The distinction this source makes is critical here. On one hand, we want rational explanations. We want logical cause and effect. We invest a lot in that.
Sure.
But underneath, there's this deeper, maybe unconscious need for a single point of blame when things feel overwhelming, uncontrollable, when they defy easy logic.
So it's less a societal failing and more just human.
That's how the source presents it, yeah.
Yeah.
A fundamental human tendency, maybe even evolutionary. Our brains want agents, causes, even when they aren't obvious. We want to know who to hold responsible. It gives a sense of control, maybe, or at least a target for the fear.
The source gives this really vivid, actually quite chilling example. A huge flood in the Texas Hill Country. Describes this slow-moving storm just sitting there dumping insane amounts of rain until a 30-foot wall of water breaks through, drowns a Christian camp, middle of the night, just horrific. And the National Weather Service, apparently stretched thin from budget cuts, tried to warn people. But the source notes, some listened, most didn't. Just like they never do until the river comes for them. That's a direct quote.
Oof. Yeah.
And yet in the aftermath, amidst all the tragedy and chaos, the conversation, according to the source, quickly turned to this kind of primitive drumbeat. Trump did this.
Right.
The source explicitly calls it scapegoat logic. That's a really strong term. What exactly does that mean here in this modern setting? And how is it different from, say, legitimate criticism of policy decisions?
It is a strong term, yeah, and used very deliberately. It forces the question, why, facing a natural disaster, would a big chunk of people immediately point the finger at a political figure like Trump?
Right. Why him specifically?
The source argues it's not about direct policy failure. It's not saying, Trump passed a law that caused the flood. That's not the claim. No. Instead, it points to something deeper, a more primal psychological thing happening. It says, and I'm quoting here because the language is pretty potent, the coverage made it sound so tidy. The staff cuts, the reduced resources, the erosion of trust, all leading back to one name, one orange face on the horizon. Trump made the flood. Trump killed those kids.
Wow. That's blunt.
Very. And then, crucially, it states flat out, this is not policy analysis. This is scapegoat logic. It's not saying policy wasn't discussed at all, but that the main narrative quickly went beyond policy into something more fundamental.
So like transcending the rational debate.
Exactly. And to illustrate, the source draws this direct line to ancient gods, like Baal, Moloch, Ra figures from myths, often tied to powerful, sometimes scary forces of nature or fate. Gods needing sacrifices or appeasement.
Or even the Old Testament God, with floods and plagues as punishment.
Precisely. The common thread is that basic human need to personify overwhelming, uncontrollable stuff. The source suggests that the self-described secular rational class, and it uses this provocative label, the coastal priesthood of academia, media, and hyper-modern humanists.
Okay, that's quite a label.
It is. It suggests this group might strongly deny believing in magic or spirits. No demons in the whirlwind, no trickster sun god messing with the harvest.
Right, they say that's absurd.
And yet the source observes they talk about Trump as if he is exactly that, a singular, almost supernatural force, a trickster sun god, a demon in the whirlwind, somehow responsible for huge, chaotic, seemingly unrelated events.
So the point isn't whether the blame is true in a policy sense.
No, the source explicitly says it's not policy analysis. The point is the pattern of assigning blame. It looks strikingly like ancient attempts to understand and control the uncontrollable by blaming a powerful, singular, maybe mythical figure. It's about the psychological job the blame is doing more than its logical basis.
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
For those of us who think we're purely rational, the source brings up the God-shaped hole, a concept maybe familiar but with a twist. Can you explain the traditional meaning first? And then how it connects to this Trump-shaped hole idea?
Absolutely. So traditionally, the God-shaped hole was a spiritual idea, right?
Yeah.
Old revival preachers, theologians talked about it gently. They described it as this innate space inside us, a kind of void that just needs to be filled by something bigger than ourselves.
Okay.
And for centuries, for countless people, that something was God, Allah, Krishna, saints, maybe the idea of a divine groom waiting after death. This belief system, the source explains, gave people a crucial framework, a way to process chaos, find meaning, even comfort in tragedy.
Like finding purpose in suffering.
Exactly. A child lost in a flood, called home by God, crops fail. A test of faith, not just random bad luck. It provided meaning. It diffused personal blame into a bigger story, often framed as a mystery wrapped in mercy. It gave sense of order, even when things felt chaotic.
So that traditional God-shaped hole offered real comfort, a way to make sense of things.
Yeah.
But the source says the modern secular priesthood, that group you mentioned, they didn't approach it that way.
No, their approach, according to the source, was totally different. This modern secular priesthood, as it's called, they actively rejected that whole idea of a spiritual void.
They thought they were beyond it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Declare themselves above it. The source says they ridiculed the faithful for needing a cosmic father or a groom waiting beyond the veil. Their core belief was that humanity had, evolved past those ancient seemingly irrational needs.
So what should they try to fill it with, if not God?
Rational stuff, modern stuff, academically approved stuff. The source lists things like credentials, moral status, hashtags, identity labels, purity tests.
Hashtags.
Yeah. Basically, they tried to build, as the source puts it, whole new tabernacles of rationalism. They genuinely believed they'd outgrown the need for meaning, for interpreting chaos, for a central explanation for the uncontrollable. They thought everything could be neatly managed through intellect, science, social constructs.
Okay, so they try plugging this fundamental human need with degrees, Twitter trends, feeling morally superior. But did it work? Did that rationalist approach actually satisfy that deep longing for meaning, for an explanation when things go haywire?
According to the source, absolutely not. It's pretty emphatic. It says, nature hates a vacuum. Powerful image, right?
Yeah.
And despite all their sophisticated attempts to fill it, the old animal wiring was still buried underneath, and crucially, the hole stayed.
Wow. So the need was still there.
Exactly. This unmet need, this lingering eclipse fear that needs a face to blame for the storm, for the unexplainable. It then took a new shape. And the source argues it became what it always becomes when people forget or deny they need to see a face in the storm. It became a trickster.
A trickster.
A cosmic scapegoat. Once that idea formed, it could be cursed, blamed, projected onto for every single unspeakable thing they cannot control.
Let me guess the name they gave that trickster.
According to the source, yeah, the name they gave it was Trump. And this is where the argument really comes together, and the distinction is absolutely vital. The source clarifies it's not the man himself, not the lumpy mortal reality of an aging real estate loudmouth from Queens.
Right, not the actual guy.
But the enormous mythic projection that lives rent-free in their heads. It's the psychological construct, the idea of him that took on its own life.
So this projected trickster.
This projected trickster sun god,
Yeah.
given these almost cartoonish features like gold toilets and tiny hands, he's then seen by this group as pulling the strings behind everything. Floods, suicides, epidemics, Ukraine, Gaza, Texas, and the minds of every citizen too stupid to resist him.
That's huge, attributing almost supernatural power.
Exactly. Far beyond any logical, earthly explanation. It's like a psychological transformation, where a real person becomes the container for all the fear, anxiety, and chaos in the world. An almost involuntary creation, born from that unfilled hole.
That is a truly remarkable claim. To say a political figure becomes a trickster god in people's minds, not through worship, but through intense fear and blame. And the source even calls this behavior a kind of religion. Unconscious maybe, but still religion. How does that work? How can something political and supposedly secular be framed in spiritual terms if there's no worship involved?
That's the core of it, and it definitely goes against how we usually think. The source argues this isn't, superstition in the sense of fairy charms or tarot decks. That's conscious magic.
Right.
This is described more as a primal reflex to cast every mystery as a punishment from a single hidden mind. So when people say Trump did this about all sorts of problems or random events, they don't think they're praying. They're not consciously performing a religious act.
No, they'd probably be horrified at the suggestion.
Exactly. Yet the source claims they are effectively feeding him exactly what gods crave: dread, constant attention, endless blame.
Right.
They do it constantly through media, conversations, social media, without realizing they're part of a ritual that, ironically, gives power to the figure they hate.
Wow. So the act of blaming itself becomes the ritual.
That's the argument. That the deep human need for a scapegoat, for an explanation, for something external to blame, taps into something ancient, something quasi-religious in how it functions psychologically, even if the people doing it would strongly deny any spiritual motive.
Okay.
And furthermore, the source points to specific actions that look a lot like ancient rituals, or at least powerful symbolic acts. He says, from the moment Trump descended the escalator in 2015, the modern urban priesthood has been building effigies to burn.
Effigies, like actual...
Well, think about the examples. The giant inflatable orange baby over London, a global symbol, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
Dartboards with his face,
Yeah.
piñatas at fundraisers, voodoo dolls on late-night shows played for laughs maybe, but symbolically potent. And critically, those hourly spiking hashtags on social media. The source calls it a digital drum circle.
A digital drum circle.
Okay, think about it. Ancient tribes drumming around a fire, focusing energy, expressing fear, trying to invoke change or ward off evil. These hashtags, in this view, serve a similar psychological role, a collective rhythmic outpouring of emotion, constantly feeding the trickster with attention, with negative focus.
Huh. I never thought of it like that.
The source acknowledges they swear they are mocking him, that it's defiance. That's the conscious intent.
Right, political protest.
But it argues, drawing on psychology and history,
Huh.
anyone who knows old magic knows what an effigy is.
Yeah.
You make an image of the thing you fear or hate, you curse it, you burn it, and you believe the flames will purify the land. It's a symbolic act, done on a huge scale, rooted in ancient purification rituals, even if we give it modern labels. The conscious goal might be mockery, but the underlying action, the source says, resonates with that older need to expel a feared entity.
That's quite a take on modern behavior. Seeing ancient rituals and hashtags and inflatable dolls. But does it work? Does this intense ritual of mockery or defiance actually achieve the goal? Does it banish the trickster god they've supposedly created?
That is a crucial question, and the source hits it directly with a really profound, maybe unsettling insight, it says quite bluntly. But burning an effigy does not always kill the spirit. Sometimes the ritual is just a sacrifice that keeps the trickster strong.
Whoa. So the act of fighting it feeds it.
That's the paradox it suggests, this powerful human tendency where the very energy we pour into fighting what we hate, the intense focus we give to condemning it, can actually trap us. It's like becoming so obsessed with a shadow you're chasing, you lose your own way. Or, darker still, your constant engagement actually nourishes the thing you want to get rid of.
So it's not just politics, it's like a psychological trap.
That's the idea. How intense focus, even negative focus, can paradoxically give power and presence to the thing you want gone, embedding it deeper in your own mind, in the collective mind. The warning from the source is pretty stark, quite chilling. Sometimes the people doing the burning forget what they're burning for. And in the oldest stories, when you lose track of the fire, you don't burn the trickster at all, you burn yourself.
Burn yourself. Meaning?
It implies this self-defeating cycle. The intense, ritualistic focus on getting rid of the perceived evil ends up consuming the participants. Their energy, their emotions, get so wrapped up in this negative projection that it harms them. Exhaustion, bitterness, a skewed view of the world. Rather than actually purifying anything or getting rid of the trickster, it's like in trying to destroy this externalized evil, they risk internalizing it, getting consumed by the fire they thought they controlled.
Okay, so we've dug into how one group, the faithless as the source terms them, seems to treat Trump like this cosmic scapegoat, this inverse god projecting fears onto him. But what about his supporters? The source calls them, kind of pointedly, the so-called cultists. How do they see him, according to this analysis? Is their relationship also religious, or is it completely different, maybe just pragmatic?
Yet this is the crucial counterpoint, a really vital, different perspective the source offers. It states very clearly that the cultists, defined as the 66% who voted for him, who drag him back on stage when the robed inquisitors shout unclean, they do not worship him like the other group projects onto him.
Okay, so no trickster god for them.
No. The source says flat out, they are not building cathedrals for Trump. It argues these supporters, the villagers it sometimes calls them, they still have their real God. Meaning Christ, Allah, Krishna, their saints, the groom who waits beyond the grave. Because they have an existing traditional spiritual framework, they don't need a trickster to explain a flood or a pandemic or chaos. Their faith already provides meaning, comfort, a way to process suffering within a divine plan. Their God-shaped hole, you could say, is already filled, in their view.
I see, so they have a different coping mechanism already in place.
Right, and instead, the source argues, these supporters see Trump not as a god, not as an idol, but purely as a tool.
A tool.
Yeah, he uses vivid language. A dumb golem, a lump of Manhattan clay, a battering ram to stand at the village gate while the blue-check priesthood tries to burn the fields.
Wow. Okay, that's blunt language again. Golem, battering ram.
It is.
Yeah.
But the source emphasizes this distinction. He is a tool, not a temple idol. It's meant to show a really specific, almost transactional relationship.
Transactional, not devotional.
Exactly. And it goes further, suggesting a deeply pragmatic, even conditional view from them. It says, when he cracks, they will break him back to dust and walk away. The villagers have always known how to bury their dead.
So their support isn't absolute, it's functional.
That's the implication. Functional, conditional. He's a means to an end, a weapon or shield, in what they see as a cultural or political war. When he stops being useful, according to this analysis, they'll discard him, like a builder throws away a broken hammer. It's a huge contrast to that almost ritualistic, fear-driven engagement described for the other group. It highlights really different underlying needs.
So it's like one side inadvertently builds him up into this mythic figure through fear and blame, while the other side sees him as just a temporary disposable tool. That's a really striking almost ironic contrast, like two totally different realities running in parallel.
Absolutely. And that leads right into what the source calls the tragic comedy. It's the core paradox of the whole analysis.
Which is,
the paradox that the people who claim they have no gods are the ones who built one. They're the ones, the source says, who unconsciously created this cosmic scapegoat who lives in their minds 24/7, who is blamed for every storm, every plague, every crack in the sidewalk.
right, the ones filling the Trump-shaped hole.
Exactly. And they'd never admit they're chanting at a volcano or doing anything primal. They use rational-sounding words, democracy, policy, accountability. But the source insists these are just spreadsheet labels pasted over ancient fear. It highlights that tension. Denying spiritual needs, but unconsciously acting them out. The source then sharpens its critique of this secular priesthood, quoting again because the analogy is strong. The same class that calls themselves the apostles of reason behaved exactly like Pharisees in the desert.
Pharisees. Okay, explain that reference a bit.
Right. So historically, Pharisees were a Jewish sect known for strict adherence to law and tradition, sometimes seen as overly focused on ritual purity and judging others. The source uses this metaphor to suggest this modern group, despite claiming reason, becomes kind of rigid, dogmatic, obsessed with moral purity tests, policing language, behavior.
Tracking defilement, as it says.
They track defilement.
Yeah.
They police every word, every hat, every handshake. And crucially, the source finishes this thought. They declare the trickster unclean, but cannot stop giving him power with every curse.
That self-defeating cycle again. Their condemnation fuels the projection.
Precisely. Every effort to diminish him inadvertently feeds the God they say doesn't exist. It's this relentless loop that actually keeps the thing they hate alive in their own minds.
So the fundamental difference between these groups, as the source portrays it, isn't just politics. It's much deeper. It's about how they interpret chaos, tragedy, how they cope with the uncontrollable stuff in life, and what fills that hole.
Exactly that. The source draws this incredibly stark, almost poetic contrast in how they handle unavoidable loss, the unexplainable. Puts it like this. The faithful see a child lost in the flood and pray there with the groom.
Finding solace in their faith.
The faithless see the same child and hiss, Trump did this.
Projecting blame onto the trickster.
And so the trickster grows. It lays bare the difference in their underlying psychological, maybe spiritual frameworks, how those frameworks dictate how they process things like death, loss, chaos. One finds meaning in a known narrative, the other, lacking that, projects fear and blame onto a secularized but still mythical figure.
Wow.
And ultimately, the source suggests when it comes down to it, facing our own mortality, all the stuff we cling to our modern status symbols, they don't last. It says, quite powerfully, the grave swallows your credentials. Your pronouns, your status, your degree, your resume, all vanish under the worms.
So sobering.
It is, and it asks what really remains, what defines how we face those deep fears, how we make meaning. It's what you whispered under your breath every night while the sky turned black. The name you gave the eclipse.
The name you gave the eclipse.
Yeah, it emphasizes that enduring power of primal fear and the deeply personal, often unconscious stories we tell ourselves to cope. It suggests our reactions to chaos, the gods or tricksters we create, actually tell us more about us, about our own inner world, than about the chaos itself.
What a really thought-provoking deep dive. Just thinking about human psychology and how these, well, ancient fears and needs still echo in our super modern world. We've looked at how that eclipse fear, that need for a who behind disaster, might shape politics, might create this Trump-shaped hole the source talks about. It definitely makes you look at the headlines differently. And the source leaves us with that really provocative conclusion, right? That stark summary of the tragic comedy. They don't want him, but they made him. They don't worship him, but they fear him. They think the flames will save them, but the flames have a mind of their own.
It's a powerful warning about unintended consequences, about how our own psychology, our projections can backfire.
Yeah.
And maybe one final thought directly from the source for everyone listening to chew on. It kind of brings the whole argument full circle, makes us look at ourselves. If it floods like a god, punishes like a god, and devours like a god, it's a god.
Okay.
Not for the villagers who built a golem to stand guard, but for the ones who hate him so much they can't stop feeding him.
Wow. So the question becomes, who are we feeding?
Exactly. It pushes us to think about our own fears, our own maybe unacknowledged needs. How do we externalize things we hate? Could we be inadvertently creating or empowering the very things we want to destroy? It makes you think about power projection and what's really going on under the surface of our public arguments.
Hmm.
In our own lives, who or what are we feeding with our constant attention, our blame? What's the real cost of those unconscious rituals we might be performing every day?